Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Yes, globalization and development. So on average, there are far fewer people in poverty across the world now than there were 10 or 20 years ago. And that's a good thing for those people who have been lifted out of poverty, but it's a problem because our model for what it is to live a middle-class lifestyle, if everybody lives like we do in the UK or the United States, then the world is in deep trouble. So there has to be a different definition of success than the one that there has been, and the world can't afford for each country to kind of go through the same process of kind of eventually finding their way to sustainability after trying every other possibility. So this is a big issue, the kind of model of what success looks like at an individual level and at a country level is a big thing.
I think the biggest problem though would definitely be overpopulation.
Mm-hmm.
That, I mean, with consumption and everything else, I think that's the biggest driver in everything that's happening because the world is so populated. Everything is sort of amplified.
That's true, yeah. So if you take an unsustainable model and then you multiply it by more people, obviously that's even worse. And yeah, in that sense, the world is overpopulated. If the model of how people lived was different, then the world would become less overpopulated immediately if we lived in a more sustainable way. But that's another example where the incentives of the individual country are different than what the world needs. So there are individual countries that are panicking about having negative growth in population. Even though that would be good for environmental sustainability, they don't want their country to be the one that's getting smaller, which means that GDP will be getting smaller, which means they won't have enough young people to pay for the older people on pensions. So there's this kind of selfish view that each individual person and then each individual country takes, and this is kind of one of the reasons why we're in a lot of trouble, is because it's the classic tragedy of the commons, that nobody's looking after the shared heritage, the shared space, because they don't own it themselves. Which is something that Aristotle argued thousands of years ago, that if you want somebody to really care about something, they have to own it. His example was the child, the person's child, that if you didn't give the ownership of the child to the parent, that like if you had a kind of shared community raising of children, it wouldn't work because people only care about things they own. So this has been a long-standing issue in human psychology, that we seem to care most about the things that we can claim as our own ownership. So we have talked about a number of the things that I had noted here on kind of our pathway to perdition here, our pathway to environmental unsustainability. The thing that I was getting at the end there was the role of the nation state, that for major changes to happen, they have to be filtered through nation states. Now, the European Union is one of the few cases where that's not 100% entirely the case, where there is some kind of supranational body that is kind of pushing things on environmental sustainability anyway, in some ways pushing things in a positive direction, even if some of the individual nation states that are a member of it are dragging their heels. So basically, I mean, the argument that in some of Ulrich Beck's later work on cosmopolitanism, he argues that we have global problems, whether it's environmental sustainability, whether it's poverty, all of these things are global problems. We can see them at the local level, but they're global in nature, and we need global solutions to address these global problems. If we keep trying to solve global problems like environmental sustainability at local and national levels, we're just kind of pushing the problem somewhere else. You know, you push the lump down here and it pops up somewhere else. People just hide their emissions by exporting them to other countries. And so basically what we need are things like the Paris Agreement on climate change, but things that are more binding, more strong. So the fact that the nation states are clinging to their sovereignty so strongly is a big problem for solving global problems like environmental sustainability. And of course, we're seeing with very locally with Brexit the kind of resurgence of nationalism that's been an issue for decades now, where as global structures for governance have started to take hold, there's been a pushback by local populations, by governments who want to retain that power in order to decide for themselves, but decide for themselves usually ends up being kind of selfish decisions that are what's good for my little local patch, and then everybody else can fend for themselves. What we haven't talked about much is industrialization. So the transformation of the economic structure of society in places like the UK has happened a couple of times. So we've gone from, over the long span of history, there were nomadic models of consumption and production. Then we had agrarian societies where it was farming. And industrialization is when we started kind of spiking on the environmental sustainability problems. So once we hit the point of factory production, of kind of mass consumption of natural resources, destruction of natural resources in order to create products on a mass scale. Now, that doesn't mean that it has to be that way. Obviously, it would be possible to have entirely renewable resources that were used for production. Trees are a renewable resource. You can just keep growing and cutting them down, growing and cutting them down. So it's not inherent in the activity that it's environmentally unsustainable. It's that that's how it's been done. And so the goal, the idea, the utopia, perhaps the naive utopian model with sustainable development is that we can keep all the good things, we can keep our iPads, we can keep our Fitbits, and we can still be environmentally sustainable. And it is still very questionable whether that's true, whether we really can keep all the goodies and not damage the planet. So the structure of how we produce goods and services is a key issue.
But don't you think that, with all the technological advancements that are being made, especially on a B2B level, that it is possible to do that if it is seamlessly integrated for end users? I mean, whatever tech.
In principle, yeah. In principle, it is possible. In practice, there are many reasons why it doesn't happen, why there are gaps, why things look better on paper for how environmentally sustainable a chain is, but then the bad parts are kind of edited out of the story. So, yes, I mean, if everything went perfectly, I could see a model where we could have it all. We could have the kind of sustainable production. But in practice, it doesn't look like that's what's happening. So even at the best cases, there's still kind of leaking on the edges with unsustainability and kind of passing off problems to other parts of the system. So I guess the question is whether that should be the goal, whether the goal should be sustainable development or it should be a combination of sustainable development and kind of reducing demands on the system. So, for example, there are kind of a whole series, like if you just kind of went through the year and looked at all of the unsustainable elements for a society, how we get to work, how, like you just kind of go through each thing and you think, okay, what would it take to radically reduce pressure on the environment with each of these elements? Christmas, when there's this kind of orgy of consumerism and then things getting thrown away. And so if we completely reimagined Christmas and it was about kind of saying nice things to people instead of giving them consumerist presents, if you kind of, so the combination model might be the things that we do keep building, we keep as sustainable as possible, but let's produce a lot less. Let's get away from the consumerist model to a different vision of what the good life looks like. It's not piles of stuff. It's a different model. That's where I'm currently leaning. So we have so I've selected Beck's Risk Society as an example of sociological theory that's quite helpful for understanding the underpinnings of the environmental crisis. There are obviously many others that could be applied to the topic and that have been applied to the topic, but we'll dive in and discuss Risk Society as a kind of exemplar theory in this area. Have you come across Risk Society previously in your degree? It has been covered. Everybody who's come across Risk Society before in the last 2 years, raise your hand. Okay, not everybody. What class was it in?
I know sociology, medicine, but I swear like some of
Okay.
the qualitative methods ones as well.
Okay, so kind of in passing, then, yeah, right. Okay. So this model, the Risk Society model, is based on the idea that that there's been a fundamental transformation in Western industrialized, developed societies from industrial society, where there was a kind of a notion of risk that was controllable, that risk was something that you can calculate, that you can handle, you can insure against. We kind of know how many, roughly on average, how many people are going to have different kinds of industrial accidents and how many problems they're going to have. And so there are things that you could control, and that was the kind of society we lived in up until about the 1940s, 50s, when the nuclear age began. So his argument is that the rise of things like nuclear weapons, of environmental crises, that industrial society kind of went so far and created so many outgrowths like pollution and this kind of thing that were so damaging that we are now in a new kind of society where we're aware that our role, that we're kind of all participating in creation of our own destruction, that humanity is responsible for producing these risks that are uncontrollable. They're kind of incalculable, the damage they could cause. So there have been attempts to calculate the cost of climate change, but there really is no way to accurately say this is precisely the cost of climate change, because it depends on so many factors. It's so big, it's across so many countries, there's so many different ways that people could react and that societies could react, that it's just a massive uncontrollable risk. And Beck argues that when we face this kind of uncertainty, this kind of intense existential uncertainty, that this affects the way we live our lives, that it kind of changes how we approach problems in society. So he connects, for example, connects these kinds of issues to a change in how politics works. So he argues that the rise of these kinds of risks that affect people in their personal lives, if you live near a polluted stream or you live where flooding is happening, that this kind of overtakes traditional politics, where people had their kind of parties that they belonged to, their sides, that something like pollution or flooding, these kinds of things transcend party politics. And so you find people getting involved in activist politics around the things that they care about, that are directly connected to what they care about, regardless of their party affiliation. And so he argues that this kind of new kind of politics, which he calls sub-politics, or a politics from below, that this is redefining and basically kind of taking some of the power away from traditional political parties.
Is that similar to, it's like an unofficial term called
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a kind of small-scale version of it, is particular individuals, and usually NIMBYism tends to be, well, I mean, the kind of high-profile cases are middle or upper-class people being very unhappy about having their nice view spoiled by some environmentally sustainable project, like with the HS2 train line. But yes, so that's the kind of localized version, but also if you imagine like a nuclear plant having a reactor meltdown, the effects of that would kind of spill out, regardless of whether you're a Tory or Labour Party supporter, you'll be affected by things like pollution. The bad air in London affects rich and poor, whether regardless of your political party, you're affected by that. Now, where I think Beck was wrong was he kind of assumed that everyone was aware of these risks that we're facing, and that this then affects how we behave, that will change. So he has this idea of reflexive modernization, that because we're now aware of the role that humans are playing in the creation of our own destruction, that this will then change our behavior, that we'll look back on ourselves, will be reflexive, and institutions will actively behave differently. And I think that was too optimistic, unfortunately, because it's actually, I think we've seen plenty of evidence that institutions can just ignore the damage they're doing. They can take advantage of the fact that there's a time lag between creating the pollution, so you're getting the money, and then the damage, by the time the damage comes back to you, by that time the CEO will have retired and it's somebody else's problem. So he has this idea of the boomerang effect, that the institutions and countries that are polluting, that they push this pollution out, and then it ultimately comes back on them, and that this then changes their behavior. And that's true. It does, ultimately it does come back, but that time lag can be a generation or two.
So what are you saying that Beck is missing?
He was too optimistic that because we're all now aware that climate change exists, that pollution is a real problem, that the way that institutions behave is damaging the environment, that awareness will change behavior and structures within these institutions. So that has happened in some cases. There are certainly corporations, institutions that have changed their policies in order to do less environmental damage. For example, some have policies where within country, travel has to be on the train, no internal flights allowed. So there are steps that are taken, but it's not society-wide. It's not all institutions. There are plenty of institutions that just will do everything they can get away with, and then try to avoid responsibility as long as possible, and run out the clock.
You think that the society doesn't take into account the disassociations that we get from time lags or wherever?
Exactly.
And it doesn't account for that in his writings?
Not in the original book or the later ones, no. I mean, his theory is widely viewed as a very pessimistic account, but I view it as kind of too optimistic on that point. And then the other point that he is not great at capturing is the distinction between real risk, things that are actually really going to kill us, versus the socially constructed risk, the things that we're scared of, the things that we believe are real risks. And those are not at all the same thing. But he kind of goes back and forth between talking about them in a way that's not totally consistent. So, for example, if you ask people, and for many years, if you ask people what risks they're afraid of, you'll get terrorism as a really high one on the list. But that is not at all the real danger that people are facing. As an individual, you're much less likely to get killed by terrorism than you are other things like car accidents and things like that. And then ultimately, obviously, these big picture phenomena like climate change. So, basically, we have this risk, these kind of these scientifically defined risks that are all around us. Things, whether it's the risk, there is a non-zero probability of the world being destroyed by nuclear weapons. That the Russia and the United States hit the button and nuclear weapons go across and destroy everything. That could happen. We don't know the exact percentage probability of that happening, but we live with the kind of background knowledge in the back of our minds that that could happen. Same for the kind of climate change risk. We increasingly face this risk, and it's kind of a background piece of information that's kind of weighing on our minds, weighing on our decisions in a way that's quite hard to quantify. So this is part of Beck's argument, is that these risks are kind of always with us, and that therefore they kind of can't help but influence our decision making and behaviors. So these examples I have here are from the Fukushima disaster in Japan. There was a tsunami that was followed by a nuclear meltdown. And one part of Beck's argument, Beck's theory, is about, he's mainly talking about risk, not about actual disasters that happen. He's talking about this kind of pending, kind of lingering, lurking risk that's kind of always with us as a companion. So once risk actually becomes disaster, once it actually turns from something that could happen to something that is actually happening, it becomes a different kind of thing. And so you could argue that we're in this phase now with climate change, where for many years it's been a risk that's been highlighted or attempted to be highlighted, and now with flooding, hurricanes, the kind of increasing frequency of these major environmental disasters, it's starting to shift from a risk that's out there that we're kind of like, yeah, that's probably going to happen, but I can't actually see it or touch it, to something where you can actually see the danger. So this kind of back and forth between real danger that's actually killing people or reducing lifespans or destroying homes versus the kind of perception of risk, where we feel like we may be at risk, we may suffer, we may not. These are the kind of like, is your phone killing you with radiation? This is an example of risk. We don't really know. We know there's radiation coming off of the smartphones, but we don't really know if it's going to give us brain cancer. So what do you do in that scenario? That's the kind of risk zone. So when you have these kind of actual disasters, the way that people approach them changes, because that you have that level of uncertainty has reduced. It's now a real thing that people can react to. And so there's been, empirical research on climate change perception. I mentioned last week that the metaphor of blanket, that climate change is like a blanket, the global warming is like a blanket rather than a greenhouse, that was found to be a better metaphor. It's also been found that if you're trying to persuade people about the risk of climate change, that's a harder thing to achieve with people who are skeptical that climate change is a real thing. But if you just set that debate aside and you focus on what can we do about it, so let's just talk about some solutions, then you get a lot more people willing to do that. So this is kind of counterintuitive, because we normally think first you have to agree on the problem, then you come up with solutions. But actually, this was research out of Australia, where they found that people who are resistant to the kind of the discussion about scientific certainty or uncertainty. Do we really know this is going to happen? What's the probability? There was a lot of difficulty around that, but once it shifted to, okay, we could reduce pollution, we could do these kinds of things, then they were willing to participate in those kinds of solution-oriented discussions, which you could see as shifting the ground from risk, from kind of something that's a little more nebulous, a little harder to frame with certainty, to something more tangible and practical. So the other major issue where we have quite a lot that we can bring to bear from sociology to help look at this kind of point is the fact that scientific risk, scientifically defined risk, is what we're talking about in many of these cases, because it's too hard to see these problems as one individual in one location. You just can't get a big enough view to be able to see the scale of the problem. And so we rely on scientific research. And that's something that we're doing every day. As soon as you get on a bus or a car or on a plane, you're relying on scientific research. It's just been filtered through technology and development over many years, so you don't think about it as relying on scientific research. But something like climate change is relatively fresh scientific research, so the ink is still dry on the scientific research. And that means that when people want to try to justify inaction or justify their existing political views, they can target the scientific research and argue that, no, it's not 100% certain, so we shouldn't do anything. And so this debate over whether this kind of claim, whether it's, there have been similar issues about sustainability of fishing stocks in Europe, where the individual fisher people don't want to acknowledge or accept the scientific conclusions about certain species being at risk and needing to be protected, because they still see them at their local level. The fish don't seem to be at risk. So then we have this kind of clash between a scientific definition of a problem and a kind of individual, personal kind of definitions of things from your own experience. You know, we're in England where it's cold and rainy, and so it's pretty hard to think about global warming being a real thing when you're, you know, bundling up and putting on your big scarf and trying to make it through the cold. So this is asking quite a lot of people to go beyond, to kind of set aside their personal experience and trust in this kind of distant scientific institution, something like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Why should they believe the IPCC? In order to get there, you need to accept several steps along the way. This thing called science is reliable. It's something we should believe in. This thing called the UN is a worthwhile body for bringing together scientists. You know, you have to kind of go along several steps, or you just trust some kind of high-profile institution. And all of these things are not easy. It's not easy to persuade somebody that they should behave differently, that they should spend resources because some distant body of experts told them that it was the right thing to do. And so this definition of problems and the fact that we rely on science in order to define these problems is a key challenge. And it's something that there's been quite a lot of scholarship looking at in sociology and science and technology studies, is the relationship between experts and non-experts and how publics view science. And generally in the UK, people have very pro-science attitudes. So if you talk to scientists, they think that everybody distrusts them and that there's a ton of public skepticism about science because there are some high-profile science skeptics. But the public opinion surveys indicate that scientist is one of the highest, most trusted professions in the UK. On the bottom end is politician and journalist. So the other dimension of this is that governments are looking after their short-term interests in terms of the next election. So they want to be seen to be doing the right thing. Again, this is something that goes back thousands of years. There was a debate between Socrates and some of his interlocutors about the nature of virtue, and the kind of sophist position, the kind of unethical position was the best thing to be able to have is to appear to do the right thing while actually secretly doing the wrong thing, so you get the benefits of both. You get seen as a virtuous person, and you get to do the stealing or whatever the bad thing is. And that kind of model is still, 2,000 years later, the dominant approach in politics, is you try to get away with as much as you can. And so we see it right now with the conservative government policy. They're doing some kind of high-profile things. They're saying the right things. They're talking about being environmentally sustainable. Today, there was a news story about the UK inquiring about becoming a zero-carbon country and what it would take in reaction to the report last week. But on the short-term practical side, they're doing things that are heading in the opposite direction, like freezing fuel duty so that it's cheaper to use fossil fuels, limiting subsidies for renewable energy, these kinds of things, because those are popular for certain people in the short term. And so this is a kind of classic dilemma. And then part of this picture, sadly I'm not thinking of great examples of this on environmental sustainability in the UK, but there are environmental groups that press the government, that demand change. And this is part of the picture in Beck's theory, as I mentioned, with subpolitics, that this kind of activist politics is something that emerges outside of the traditional party political structure, although often the party political structure tries to incorporate it. So it kind of breaks loose, and then they try to encompass it, to get it back inside one of the parties, or both will try to take credit for that area. But that is a pathway to achieving social change as well. So